welcome to the 10-12 overtime. We do these interviews each week as an opportunity to dig deeper into a very specific topic, subject, or some statistics. Today, we're taking a bit of a divergence away from statistical talk, and we're bringing on one of our absolute favorite guests to have on the podcast every time we can. He is, of course, Shehan Jeyarajah of CBS Sports. I mean, one of the number one national Big 12 voices, both in because he's really good and because there aren't very many good ones. So we're always pleased to have Shehan joining us. Shehan, welcome, man.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a little while.
I think it's been since we did our rankings week back in July.
Yeah. I guess it has. No, it's this year has been, I mean, as you can imagine, we have our first kid, so it's obviously like everything is foggy and hazy and flies by. So anyway, regardless, it's good to be back.
Always a pleasure. Fatherhood is fun and new and exciting. And throw that in with this. I don't know, what's wilder to you? You're being a dad for the first time or this 2024 college football season?
Probably trying to do both at the same time.
There we go.
That
There
that's
we go.
that's been an adventure. No, I mean it's the funny thing is, like with this college football season, there's just been so much unexpected and so much movement that it's almost like, what do you even follow in some ways, right? Like, what teams do you double down on? Obviously there's some of the obvious ones that are playing well, right? There's Oregon, there's BYU, the way that, but like, things change in a week, right? Like Iowa
Yeah.
State, right in the middle of, they were top 7 or 8, and now all of a sudden they're, probably going to be closer to 20. Like it just changes so much week to week. It makes it hard to almost get a full feel. And we're in the month of November now.
You just described the Big 12 every year.
Yes,
The
yes.
the entire college football season this year has chosen to just mirror the Big 12 every year, which is just perfect. Perfect. Everyone's getting a taste of what Big 12 fans are used to on a regular basis. So we brought you on today because you put out last week a Big 12 quarterback tiering system, not a 1 through 16, but a tiering system. And so I wanted to kind of go over it with you, go over it in comparison to the one that you put out before the season start. I did a little Googling and then just kind of project ahead. But because I think this conversation is always interesting. Quarterbacks, I know they get a lot of the attention, but it is interesting to look at this batch of quarterbacks this year and where we are now compared to where we thought we would be before the season. I think it's a really interesting conversation because of how much of the preseason talk about quarterbacks influenced how we thought seasons would go, and then how that has impacted teams and where we are. So I want to start with your tier one, which is available on cbssports.com for everybody who wants to go and check that out. I'm going to see if I can get this to work. Sometimes this stuff works for me and sometimes it doesn't. Am I technologically savvy enough? Perfect. All right. So, oh no, that's last year's. Forgive me. Okay, let's pull up this year's or the new one. Okay, so tier one. See, this is sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's me. Right now, you've got Shedeur Sanders at Colorado, Rocco Becht at Iowa State, and Jake Retzlaff at BYU, and that's it. That is the tier one of Big 12 quarterbacks in your mind right now. What gave these three? What in about these three separated them from the rest of the pack in the conference?
Well, I think it's interesting, right? And by the way, I will mention obviously this was done before last week, so I think that Rocco Beck maybe hurt his case a little bit as one of the top tier one quarterbacks. But to me, these are three guys whose teams like really rely on them. They're guys who have executed, they're guys who have delivered, and all three in kind of different ways. I mean, Shedeur Sanders, you don't really have to explain all that much. He is such a big part of what they do, obviously, at Colorado. I would make the case that between Travis Hunter and when you look at Shedeur Sanders, like that's kind of the entire Colorado offense at times. They've got some other good receivers, but that's the main part of it. And he's stepped up and delivered in every which way. I think that when you make a case for Rocco Becht, like this is a player who I think has given Iowa State a different kind of ceiling. I think that they've changed the way that they can approach games. I've said before, I feel like a lot of the way that Iowa State struggled in close games was because they didn't have that dynamic passing aspect. And I think Rocco Becht has given it to them over the past couple of weeks. And then for Jake Retzlaff, this was probably the most interesting one to me in a lot of ways. And the reason that I say that is because when you think of Jake Retzlaff, like I said in the article, it's easy to poke holes in his game, honestly, right? Like he's not as accurate as some of the other guys. He's not as big of a downfield passer as some of these other guys, but he is just a playmaker. Every single time BYU needs a play, he is somebody who shows up, who executes. He gives you a lot with his playmaking with his legs. He gives you a big amount with his arms. He is really clutch. He's done it in clutch moments, especially that game-winning touchdown pass to Kamari Lassiter a couple weeks ago. So, like at this point, I mean, it's frankly just a results driven thing. Like Jake Retzlaff has been one of the most successful quarterbacks in the Big 12, and he has to be in tier one.
I mean, I think the argument for all those guys makes sense. And obviously, Shedeur played this week. Rocco Becht, tough game. I don't know. Thanks for the rat poison, Shedeur. Shehan, sorry. But I think it makes sense to have them there. And it's really interesting when you look at this. And I'm going to pull up the article again because you vary. And look, it's always nice when people are willing to show what they did before. Man, this isn't gonna. This doesn't want. Come on. Work. There we go. Where you had them in the preseason. Shador's the only one who has, I would say, lived up to the preseason expectations in the Big 12 of the quarterbacks that are here. And we'll get to that in just a second. I do want to go down to our tier 2, and you call them rising stars. This is a big collection of quarterbacks. You've got Avery Johnson at Kansas State, Sawyer Robertson at Baylor, Brendan Sorsby at Cincinnati, Josh Hoover at TCU, Baron Morton time at Texas Tech, and Sam Levitt at Arizona State. And it's a big chunk, but most of the time your middle group's going to be a larger collection. I mean, some of these names make sense. Avery Johnson, still a rising star we've seen highs from and we've seen lows from. Sawyer Robertson's obviously a guy that wasn't even the projected starter before the year, and now he's risen all the way up to tier 2. Brendan Sorsby, I think, is one that we've talked about on the show a lot, but from just how impressive he has been for Cincinnati and how much better they are offensively because of him. You look through this list, and which ones are the guys that really have stuck out to you most? Who was closest to maybe making the tier 1 of this collection of 6 quarterbacks?
Well, I do think that Avery Johnson is probably the closest. I went back and forth with having him as part of my tier 1, and the talent is obvious, right? Like his highs are so high. He's able to give you a lot with his legs. The thing that just held me back a little bit was the inconsistency. There have been games where he just, I mean, again, you get below 60% completion percentage where he has interceptions. I mean, you look even, of course, this week against Houston, he wasn't all that good. And this is to be expected of a young quarterback. Like these are growing pains. I think that that's very normal. I think that all of them are on track to within the year end up in tier 1, honestly. Like there's a lot of talented quarterbacks in this group. Obviously I'm a Baylor guy, but like Sawyer Robertson, if he was the day 1 starter, he might be in the tier 1 group too. He has been so impressive over the past 3 or 4 weeks, been such a huge part of Baylor turning things around, ultimately putting themselves in a position to be back in bowl eligibility. And I think, look, I mean, what they needed from him too was they needed playmaking. They thought that they were going to get a little more of that with a more athletic DeQuan Finn, but I think that Sawyer Robertson has grown so much, especially when you compare him to years past. So that's another quarterback who, again, maybe by the time that we're heading into next season is moving into tier 1 as well. I will say too, Josh Hoover was probably the toughest one of the entire group for me to try and gauge because his highs are obvious. I mean, he is the most productive quarterback in the Big 12, but the mistakes are just so big and they put so much on him, which is part of why he's so productive, but also part of why he has so many mistakes. So, he's somebody that I think would benefit a lot if TCU's able to ultimately develop just a little bit more of a run game so that they don't have to pass the ball quite as much as they do in 2024.
Yeah, he's a guy that was kind of I don't want to say an enigma heading into the year, but a guy that was kind of like, what is he going to be? I think he was you say he's one of the hardest ones to judge now. I think he was one of the hardest ones to judge coming into the year. So nothing's really changed for Josh Hoover at TCU. And I don't know how much of that's Josh Hoover and how much of that's just everything around him, right? As you mentioned, the lack of running game. There are some questions about the coaching staff, specifically on the offensive side of the ball. And so he is a very interesting quarterback. And I think this tier 2, I think one of the things about them is a lot of them they're all very interesting quarterbacks who have been really good when they needed to be and have had some off moments. I think to Baron Morton, who I think Maybe the worst of the group is where I would kind of put him. Sam Levitt as another guy, along with Brennan Sorsby, where it's just kind of no expectation coming into the year, or low expectation, and have flourished at their new schools. Two guys who have transferred in, and so it's really impressive to see this list of guys who have risen up kind of out of nowhere. Because and it's the Big 12. Like it's just the teams, the players. This is what we deal with in this conference every year. I'm going to skip the disappointing guys. That would be the tier three: the Fafita, the Garrett Green, and the Jalen Daniels. I'm more interested in your tier four, what you're calling bad situations. Now, I want to bring that up because I'm intrigued by how you're describing this. It's called bad situations, not bad players, not bad, just bad situations. And so you look at this collection of Zion Chris at Houston, who again, not the starter coming into the season, Alan Bowman at
Yeah.
OSU, Isaac
And by the
Wilson.
way, after last week, like he's making a case to move up, certainly,
Yes, he
but I
is.
think right now he obviously is a tier four guy.
So how much of when you call this bad situation, how much of this is about the quarterback itself, and how much of about is just what he has around him?
Well, I think that both have to be part of it because the other thing too is when you look at all of these situations, I believe all of them have played multiple quarterbacks to this point, and none have been able to find success. Now, of course, with Utah, you're talking about the Cameron Rising injury and having to play a true freshman, but they've got other guys there. They don't really want to try them out. With UCF, they've moved to through three or four quarterbacks to this point. Like, I think that there are flaws in these programs right now, whether it be because of injuries, whether it be, I mean, in the case of Houston, they're a rebuilding roster in a lot of ways. Like I just don't think that it's set up very well for almost any quarterback to succeed at that point. And the other thing too is that when I looked at that group, the thing that was most concerning to me was I don't think any of them clearly have their guy moving forward. Now, maybe that's changing, right? Maybe Zion Chris is becoming that guy. Isaac Wilson, you think will eventually be that guy. But if I'm going into 2025, I have a little bit of concern about that. UCF, I don't think has their guy to this point. Oklahoma State, certainly, they just have not come up with a long-term answer at the position. And so that's really what concerns me the most about all of these situations is I look at the guys, especially who are in tier two. One of the things that I love about them is that all of them essentially can be back in 2025. These are guys who can shape the conference heading forward. I don't know that the bottom four at this point have proven that there's a guy among them who's ready to do that right away.
And I think of the four of them, Zion Chris, the one we think has the most potential. Isaac Wilson, maybe an offseason as the starter, gives him a better situation. I mean, Oklahoma State's problem right now is that everyone's hurt. You've lost Zane Flores. You tried to move to Garrett Rangel. He got hurt in the BYU game and is out. Now it's, do you play the true freshman or do you just keep Alan Bowman out there for what feels like a lost season? So definitely feel that way with Oklahoma State. Looking at this compared to where it was in the preseason, who has surprised you the most? Who has disappointed you the most? You mentioned it. We mentioned the three disappointments being Fafita and Jalen Daniels and Garrett Green. Let's start with the disappointment first. Let's end on the high note. Which of the three that you have as your disappointments has been the biggest disappointment to you?
Well, look, I think there's context for all three of those guys. And so even just in the case of Noah Fafita, for example, like I think that the roster around him got substantially worse than people realized. Now, I think that the thing that's disappointing to me, and again, there's context to it, is the Jalen Daniels situation because I do think that unlike those other two guys, he clearly has enough to win. He clearly has enough to work with around him, and it's been bad quarterback play that's been the catalyst behind Kansas's poor season. Now, I think that when we sit back and look and really evaluate nationally at the end of the year, these guys who have been out essentially a year and haven't played any football for essentially a year, almost none of them have played at a high level. Cam Rising was doing it a little bit before he got hurt, but that's kind of the exception at this point. There are so many other examples of guys who missed a lot of the previous season and just aren't playing well at this point. So I think Jalen Daniels has to be that top one to me. I mean, he is just so talented. When he has been in this offense before, like he's been such a big part of it. And he was somebody who I really felt like if Kansas was going to take the step that we expected to go from a 9-win team to a Big 12 championship contender, he was going to be the catalyst of it. I felt like he would give them more upside than what Jason Bean gave them last year, and they still won 9 games with Jason Bean. But it's been turnovers, it's been bad decisions, and the game is just moving really fast for him. Now, I do think over the past 2 or 3 weeks, we started to see a better Jalen Daniels, and I think that Kansas is going to be better as a result. But it's just so far into the season, it's hard to see it fully turning around.
I mean, it's obviously a frustrating season for Kansas. It's hard not to look at that OC change and say, giant red circle along with guy who's had back injuries coming back after not playing a lot over the last 2 seasons, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I feel like Garrett Green, I mean, yeah, I get the disappointment part. There was a lot of like, could he continue to take the next step? And he really hasn't. Like he doesn't, he kind of looks like the same guy as he was last year, except that this year he's not completing the insanely deep passes that he was last year, and the flaws are still the same flaws. And Fafita, like, yeah, I, I still can't figure out if we over evaluated what they lost or if this is just like you went through a coaching change and made some bad coaching hire. Again, we look at a new OC, and I don't think that's worked out real well considering you basically benched your offensive coordinator. And so I some of this is, I think, on the players, but some of this is just we have to evaluate offensive coordinator changes in situations like this and how big those things are, and how much I think in all 3 situations to some extent they had an effect on what these teams did and these quarterbacks look
Well,
like this year.
Well, and I think that so to quickly touch on West Virginia, I mean, I think that for them, right, like you said, they're not hitting the deep shots at the same level. I think they're asking him to do stuff in the intermediate game that Garrett Green I just don't think is built to do at a high level. Like they kind of need him to just be a gamer, and they wanted him to kind of be a full quarterback. And it's just college football history is littered with guys who were asked to do too much and were ultimately unable to do it. On the Noah Fafita front and the Arizona front in general, I mean, the reality is, right, like they brought in this staff and were essentially like replicate another staff who none of you have been a part of, that none of you understand or were around for. And I like it's just such a tough situation for everybody, right? And we've seen Noah Fafita at times revert to just like, I don't trust any of my receivers other than T Mac. And I pulled up a stat the other day. Tetraroya McMillan has like it's like 65% of all of the receptions and receiving yards on the team. Like he does not target other wide receivers. He targets tight ends, he targets running backs, but he does not trust the rest of his wide receivers. And they haven't run the ball at a consistent level as well. And like you mentioned, there's been offensive coordinator turnaround already. So I just think that if you wanted to do this, you probably should have just hired Brendan Carroll as your head coach, right? You should have kept the same offensive staff and said, look, maybe this is to try to keep one team together, but maybe it was worth it just to try to keep this one team together. So again, all of them have context for why things have gone badly, but I think that certainly when you look at the passing games for all 3 of these teams, they've been a big part of not necessarily being bad, but underwhelming.
Yeah, I think there's still this belief of we got this great team, we'll just stick a new coach in there. They did it at Miami years ago and it won a national championship. And it doesn't, y'all, it's not the same as back in the
Yeah.
early 2000s and 90s and 80s. So we shouldn't expect that kind of
And
thing. And it's
maybe
not.
there are some guys that the University of Miami had that the University of Arizona might not have had.
I I uh I went and looked up that roster one day, and I would just like, if you've never looked up that Miami roster,
Yeah.
do yourself a favor and do so, and just go, what,
Look up
what,
the wide receiver. Oh, or sorry, the look
the
up the
running
running
backs.
back room. The running
You're
back room specifically is isn't it like Willis McGahee was the third stringer or something like that?
Frank Gore Sr.
Frank Gore
was the
Sr. was
fourth string running back. Okay. On that
it's
team. Like he
crazy.
couldn't even
It's
get like
crazy.
Frank Gore. Okay, people.
Yeah.
All right, so let's project ahead just a little bit.
Yes, it is.
Looking towards the last few weeks of the season, our race here for the Big 12 Conference Championship game, BYU. It feels like BYU and who's going to be joining them in Arlington, especially with Kansas State taking a second loss, Iowa State taking a loss. It gives BYU a lot more wiggle room with that Kansas State tiebreaker and not facing any of the other contenders the rest of the way. So either we're going to get into some really weird tiebreaker stuff, or it's going to be BYU and someone else. And with Texas Tech and Colorado playing this Saturday, I think we have what I would call an elimination game for Arlington there in Lubbock. So looking at this moving forward, is which of the quarterbacks do you think, and obviously three of them in Sanders, Becht, and Retzlaff, big impact, but which one would you, if you had to pick one to say, this guy's going to have the biggest impact on who is in Arlington in December competing for a Big 12 championship game, which quarterback do you think it is?
I think that the answer is Jake Retzlaff. And the reason that I say that is because of the totality of what they put on him, obviously, both as a passer and as a rusher. Now, as LJ Martin's been a little healthier, they haven't needed to lean on Retzlaff quite as much as they did in previous weeks. But like I think when you look through the first 8 games of the season, Jake Retzlaff is just a guy who's made every play that they needed, both through the air and on the ground. And I think that his pure playmaking ability just fits in so well with what BYU does on defense. I actually got the chance to talk to a lot of folks over at BYU last week for a story I'm writing this week. And, I asked them, I'm like, look, you look at your kind of statistical profile, you don't really have a guy, right? Like you don't have a great edge rusher or an all-American receiver. Like Jake Retzlaff's a good player, but he's not going to be an all-American. Maybe he'll be all Big 12, but probably second team behind Shedeur Sanders. But I think that Retzlaff just emphasizes, especially versus last year's team, just finding value in the margins, right? Like being able to convert a 3rd and 2 because he sees an opening and takes it with his legs, being able to hit that intermediate pass. Like he just does so many things for that team. Now, again, look, there's also like the no-brainer parts of Shedeur Sanders' game, right? Where he is just so much of that offense from a pure production standpoint. I mean, he has Colorado wouldn't be in this position if he didn't throw that Hail Mary to LeJontay Wester, right? But I think that Jake Retzlaff also has a very unique role on this BYU team, and it's not just from the perspective of making it to Arlington, but it's also the opportunity to win in Arlington and go to the playoff that I think that makes Retzlaff so important to this team.
I love that guy. I love this BYU story. I love it's been so much fun to follow throughout the season and the questions about the valid questions about this team as they had the start that they had and have continued to get better and healthier. I mean, your point on LJ Martin is very, very true. Like he has been so big for them to get back, and the impact he's had in these games moving forward with him healthy has been huge for them. And the fact that they survived as long as they did with all the running back injuries that they dealt with is, I mean, testament. Some teams have those seasons, right? And we can talk about luck factor and we can talk about schedule, strength of schedule, but they've just found ways over and over again. Huge Holy War this weekend. Very excited for our first Holy War in the Big 12. Cannot wait for that one. Shehan, man, it's always a pleasure. I love having you on. It has been too long, and so we won't wait nearly as long next time. I promise. We're going to get you on the podcast here soon. But do me a favor, as you mentioned, you're writing an article about BYU. We've got this article that's up, and you also have a very, very good college football playoff podcast. Where can everybody find all of the work that you do covering college football and the Big 12 especially?
Yeah, you can find all my work at cbssports.com. You can follow me on basically every social media platform at Shehan Jeyarajah. You can listen to our podcast, the College Football Survivor Show, which where we go deep in on the playoff conversation and all the dynamics around it. And like I mentioned, I have a piece coming out later this week on BYU that hopefully I'll have done by the end of the day today. It's something I'm working on right now. And I also have a lot of playoff coverage coming out as well, not just from the perspective of who are the teams and where are they ranked, but also like, hey, if you're a Big 12 fan, what do you need to be watching for when this first ranking comes out?
Love it, Shehan. Always a pleasure, man. Appreciate it. You do great work. Everybody go find all of Shehan's work. Give it a look. He'll respond. He'll react with you. I mean, don't be a jerk, but he will respond to things, and we love that about him. Shehan, again, thanks a lot, man.
Thank you so much for having me.